Let's go ahead and get EF-Core to capture and share logs. .NET has a rich logging API, and EF-Core extends that by adding logging features that are specific to EF-Core. In addition to capturing the SQL that's heading to the database, the logger also exposes details about change tracker activity, other interactions with the database, and even database transactions. It also allows you to configure how much detail is sent to the log, and it also gives you a lot of filtering capabilities. Since we're working with a console app, the best place to add this is directly in the Pub Context class. Later in the course, we'll build an ASP.NET Core app that uses EF-Core, and you'll see that the logging is already built into ASP.NET Core. But much of what you'll learn here will apply at that point as well. We'll use what's referred to by the EF-Core team as simple logging. It's a simple-to-use API, and you don't have to add any extra NuGet packages. Everything you need is already available with the base Entity Framework Core package. It is possible to work directly with the .NET logging APIs if you need to do something much more substantial. I personally have not yet found a need to go beyond EF-Core's simple logging. And simple it is. Simple logging is part of the options builder when configuring a DB context, just like specifying a database provider. There's a method called log_to, which configures the DB context to output its logs. So I'll go to the code where we're setting the DB context options builder in onConfiguring and add on the log_to method. There's no default target for where the logs should be sent. You always have to specify one. And since I'm already running in a console app, I'll target the console. And the way to do that is using the delegate console write line. And remember, with a delegate, you don't write it as a method, so there's no open and close paren after that. I will show you some other targets a bit later. I'll run a simple method that does nothing more than getting a list of authors so you can see what the logs track by default. And it's a lot of information. It's not just the SQL, but activity from EF-Core as well. It's logging its compilation steps, then opening a connection, creating and executing DB commands, and a lot more. This can be useful information for finding out where exactly in the process a problem is occurring, or even if you're doing performance tuning. You can see which steps are taking too long. After executing, then we see the steps EF-Core goes through to read the results and then start tracking the data that it's retrieved. It's a lot of information. It's rare that you need to see all of those logging details. Let's take a look at filtering the logs by EF-Core command type. EF-Core defines a large variety of message categories. You can apply a parameter to filter on one or more of these categories to include in the log. In fact, the categories are displayed in the log. So let's take a look at that log that got output already. The categories are included with each log line, so here are a few. Microsoft Entity Framework Core Infrastructure, Microsoft Entity Framework Core Query, and further down, Microsoft Entity Framework Core Database Command. And there are plenty more. And you can also see the log level that's displayed at the beginning of each line. Notice that most of these are tagged as dbug or debug, but the first two are warn and info. I'll scroll down and you can also see one in the middle of all these that's tagged as info. And in fact, the log right before it says that EF-Core is executing a command, and that happens to be a debug level log message. But the very next one, which occurs after the command was executed, is an info log level. So looking at what's available generally in the logs can be really helpful as you start determining which information you want to see. And then you can apply the relevant filters in the log_to command. I'm going to tell the logging to only show the logs coming from the database command message category. Because it's possible to add more than one message category, the parameter expects an array. So I'll create a new array with new and square brackets, and then I'll put the list, of which there's only going to be one for now, in braces. The expected parameter is actually a string, and the really easy way to get that is to start drilling into the class you want, in my case dbloggerCategory.database.command, and then append the .NET property name to it. that will return a string representing that particular logger category. If you wanted to add more message categories in here, you would just comma separate them. When I run the app again, now there is a lot less information in the logs, and you can see that the messages are all from the database command category. It's showing details only about the command creation with command creating and command created, and it also shows command execution before and after, and then at the end it shows that the data reader is disposing. Most of the command execution details are there for debugging purposes, and again you can tell that because of the log levels in each line of the log. So I'll filter down one more time using the log level parameter of the log2 method to request only the information log levels. And notice that when I added the log level, Visual Studio added the using statement for Microsoft Extensions logging, where log level lives. When I run the query again, all I'm seeing in the log is the SQL that was sent in the command to the database. So if I am just looking to see the SQL, I can now use this instead of the SQL profiler. But with this logging, I also have the option of seeing a lot more information as needed. Here's a list of all of the log level enums from the .NET Logging API. There are a lot more ways you can slice and dice the EF Core logs. Not just filtering, you can even control the formatting. Here's a list of the types of things you can control. You can affect how the logs are formatted. You can have them output detailed error information. There's a category of event types, which we haven't seen here, but you can use event types for filtering as well. There are even more ways to control what kind of information goes into the logs. But for me, the most important item on the list is the one on the bottom, the ability to control whether or not sensitive information is displayed in the logs. I'm going to demonstrate that particular feature, but for all the rest, I'll point you to the EF Core docs to learn more. And there will be a link at the end of this module to this particular section of the docs. So, back to displaying sensitive information. By default, the values of parameters, which could contain sensitive information, are not shown, but you might need to see them when you're debugging. Let's take a look at how that works. Let me show you a before and after of this feature. I've modified my query to filter on authors whose last name is Ozeki, but I'm not hard-coding Ozeki into the query. I'm passing that in by a variable, which, as you've seen already, will result in a parameterized query. Notice that the log doesn't show the actual value of the parameter. Instead, it just has a question mark. The reason it does this is that parameters, whether it's for filtering queries or parameters used for inserting or updating data, might contain sensitive information. Imagine someone's social security or national ID number showing up in the logs. So by default, the parameters are hidden from the logs. In a controlled environment, or just working with test data, it might be perfectly reasonable to expose that information, and we have a way to do that. The Enable Sensitive Data Logging method of DB Context Options will allow those values to be displayed. So I'll go ahead and add the Enable Sensitive Data Logging method to my Options Builder code, and then I'll run the app, and now you can see the parameter value Ozeki is now showing in the log. I'll be leaving Enable Sensitive Logging in place for the rest of this course so that we can always see incoming data anytime we look at the logs as we continue in our exploration of using EF Core to interact with a database. Before wrapping up, I want to give you a little more insight into the targets of the logs. This won't be a deep dive, but I think it's important that you be aware of the options. In addition to outputting to a console, you can also output to a StreamWriter, which lets you save its contents to a file. You can output to the debug window, and most importantly, if you already have a logging solution that you use, you can output the logs to other logging APIs and continue to benefit from them. You saw already that one target was the delegate for console write line to output the logs to the console. Another useful delegate you can use is a StreamWriter if you want to output to a file. First, you need to instantiate a StreamWriter object, and then the delegate would be the writer's write line method. And it is really important that the file gets closed when you're done. That's how it gets saved as a file instead of just being in memory. and you can ensure that by disposing the stream writer, which you can do when the context is disposed. That means you need to override the dispose method in dbcontext, as I'm doing here, so that you can add the extra logic in, calling dispose on your stream writer. Not all targets are expressed as a delegate. For example, if you want to target the debug window, then you have to use a lambda expression, as you can see from this final example. I'm also going to share an interesting gotcha about targeting the console that someone taking an earlier version of this course discovered, and I spent some time researching to solve this problem. It's a little advanced, but I still want to share it with you. The viewer was storing his SQL Server data in Arabic, which uses a special code page. The Arabic letters showed up just fine in Visual Studio and in SQL Server, but not in the console output. So when he was looking at the logs, in place of any Arabic letters that were in the parameters, you would only see question marks. I just wanted to make sure you were aware of it and point you to a GitHub repository I created that shows an easy way to resolve this problem, and I'll link to that in the resources slide. Logging is such an important way to understand what's going on in your application, especially when you're trying to debug problems. But I find it also to be really educational when I'm learning new APIs. When people think of logging with EF Core, they often don't see past their desire to look at the SQL. But as you've seen, the EF Core API can show you that and so much more. It captures a lot of activity performed by the DB context from its change tracker to its database class. The simple logging is definitely simple, using the log2 method that you can add to the DB context options builder. Because EF Core's logger is an extension of .NET's logging APIs, from the log level filters and the ability to target where the logs get output. Adding to that, EF Core gives you more control of that output by filtering on category message types and even other filters. The EF Core logger is careful to hide incoming command parameters by default because of the possibility of exposing sensitive data. But in the case that you do want to see that information, you learned that you can just add the enable sensitive data logging method to the options builder, which I'll be leaving enabled for the rest of this course. And there are even more ways to configure EF Core's logs, and the EF Core docs are a great resource to learn about them. Now that we've got the logging in place, in the next module, we'll get back to executing queries and save changes as we interact with the one-to-many relationship that you defined earlier. And the logs will get pretty interesting. Here are some resources I've mentioned in this module, including the GitHub repository that I created to show the fix for displaying special encodings when your logs are output to the console window. I'm Julie Lerman, and thanks again for watching Entity Framework Core 6 Fundamentals. Hello, I'm Julie Lerman. Welcome back to Entity Framework Core 6 Fundamentals. Now that you've learned how to query, insert, update, and delete simple objects, it's time to discover how to do the same with data that's across relationships. We'll start with the existing one-to-many relationship in our model between author and books. And you might recall inserting some books in the very first demo at the start of this course. Now we'll add some more of our author's books to the database. And with some books in there, you'll be able to learn about querying related data by including it in queries for the parent data or after the parent data is already in memory. Then you'll see how you can navigate through those relationships when you're building your queries to do things like filtering and sorting. Then we'll start working on modifying relationships, whether you're editing or deleting the related data. And it's definitely easier to make those changes when EF Core is tracking your objects, but it's also really important to understand how to let EF Core know what to do when persisting relationships that it hasn't been tracking. So you'll get some insight into that too, which we'll dig into more deeply when we get to building a web app later in this course. There are so many variations on cause and effect with how the change tracker handles related data. And we'll use our one-to-many relationship to learn from, which means you'll need to buckle up for this module. But when we start looking at other types of relationships in the following modules, you'll already have the benefit of understanding so much of this behavior. So those will be a lot lighter. So let's get started.